Добрий день, я вітаю.
Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Ola Atamanova and the Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum starts its operation today. It's been 10 years of the war and today is day 449 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor, and today we all celebrate the day of Vyshivanka, the day dedicated to preservation of our genetic code, of our traditions, but at the same time today, 18th of May, is the commemoration day. Today we commemorate the deportation of Crimean Tatars, and today many of our events will be dedicated to this date. We will remember the events of year 1944 of the genocide. So our brief schedule for today is as follows. At 12 o'clock we will be having a special event called War Crimes Against Crimean Tatars, the signature of those who found guilty committing the 1944 deportation. Joining us will be Aziz Umerov, the brother of Eleni Umerova, a victim held illegally in a Moscow pretrial detention center for political reasons. Adil Girey Ablatifov, Crimean Institute of Civil Society representative, son of the deceased soldier Rustem Ablatifov. Ilimdar Khojametov, the armed forces of Ukrainian serviceman and activist who was forced to leave Crimea after the beginning of its occupation. Also joining us will be Yevgen Yaroshenko, Crimea SOS analyst, and Olga Skripnik, the head of the Crimean Human Rights Group. At 14 o'clock we will be talking about the grain deal, about the movements that have happened in our grain deal. We will be talking about the elections in Turkey, and joining us online will be Ukraine's ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary to the Republic of Turkey, Vasil Bodnar. And right now I want to invite our speaker, Onysiia Syniuk, legal analyst at ZMINA Center for Human Rights. Miss Onysiia, please, the floor is yours. Let's talk about the crimes committed by Soviet Union, the experience of those crimes that Russia continues to commit today. We all know that deportation is still going on, just as it was happening back in 1944. So please, the floor is yours. Good morning, everybody. Really, the deportation is not a new thing, not a new crime being committed by Russian Federation, and just like back in 44, they continue committing this crime just under a different premise, adapted to the cameras, to the modern day. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the scale of deportation of Ukrainian population, first of all, the movement of the people inside the occupied territories and deportation to Russia grew significantly. During our research, we studied all the circumstances of movement of Ukrainians from occupied territories to Russia and to other occupied territories. So we consider the circumstances, we consider the options for those persons, whether they wanted to be displaced or not, and under which circumstances their living may be viewed as deportation. Our research is being based on the research of the open sources, the secondary facts, but we also had opportunity to talk directly to those affected by deportation of Ukrainians. So the first thing to highlight is that the deportation committed by Russian Federation is not evacuation, regardless of all the statements made by the government officials of Russian Federation. The actions of Russian Federation do not fall under the requirements of evacuation as per the international humanitarian law. The only lawful way of movement of population is evacuation, which should be based on two reasons: either to ensure the safety and security of the people, or due to some significant reasons of military nature. Only one of such reasons may become a reason to move the people. In case of displacement of Ukrainian population to Russia, no such circumstances were confirmed, specifically by the evidences of the Kharkiv region inhabitants. Russian military and the locals who collaborated with them were walking from one house to another and called everybody to leave urgently because Ukraine is in offensive and the village would not exist very long. At that moment there were no shellings by the Ukrainian armed forces. Meanwhile the Russians moved their material to the nearest forest and started shelling the village, thus forcing the people to leave. This is no reason which can serve as a reason for evacuation of people. Another situation that they use is the humanitarian catastrophe in the occupied territories, the lack of power supply, lack of water or food, and other basic elements of infrastructure. In view of the fact that Russia is guilty of this humanitarian catastrophe, specifically in Mariupol, due to destruction of medical institutions, for example, they cannot refer to this reason as the reason to evacuate the people. On top of that, talking about evacuation, the country which evacuates the population, they are obliged to bring the people back after the threat is mitigated, and it means not to create obstacles for the people to come back to their homes and to assist actively those people during their return to their homes. So in view of the facts, first of all, there are facilities being destroyed in the occupied territories, including residential areas. And besides, Russian military, they build in the people's houses, thus depriving them of this option to come back. Also, we documented the facts when Russians were creating obstacles for the people to come back to Ukraine. For example, when Ukrainians are being brought to Russian Federation, they are being forwarded to the remote regions of Russia. They are being put on the special trains and they are not even being told where that train is going to. They are being separated from the persons with whom they travel all the time, and sometimes there were even cases when people were impeded from buying tickets to the other countries. For example, one of the affected persons reported that she was impeded from buying a ticket to a European Union country from Russia thrice. Once, for example, based on the absence of the certificate of birth for their kid, and second time, for example, due to the coronavirus epidemics in European Union. Besides, the country responsible for evacuation should cover the basic needs of those being evacuated, for example, their billeting, the basic hygienic needs, and food ratios at place of their billeting. We documented a number of violations of all those requirements. For example, once people were on the way to the border with Russian Federation for 3 days, they were not given any food or water, and only the elderly ones were allowed to walk out of the transport during the stops. That's a violation which was documented numerous times. Besides, filtration by Russian Federation, which results in provocative questions in presence of the military with the weapons in their hands, like, how do you treat the military operation? Are you ready to give away your life for your mother, for your homeland? Also, the families are being separated, people are being taken pictures of, they are being fingerprinted, the content of their phones and contact lists is being copied. And generally, the way evacuation is going on, it may be considered a violation because it was happening in the conditions of fear. Specifically, the residents of the Kharkiv region reported that in their region evacuation was happening during the night time. They were visited by the representatives of Russian armed forces. They were ordered to take their paperwork, their IDs, and go to the village council for evacuation. People were loaded on the buses and brought away to Russia. In another case, in Mariupol, the Russian military came to a shelter where the civilians were hiding, and they said that the Chechen units are about to arrive with clearing mission, and the people only have 30 minutes to leave the shelter. Another important factor evidencing that evacuation was not for the sake of protection of population, but it was aimed at displacement of the people, is the fact that those actions were planned ahead. They were not a response to any threat, because way before the 24th of February, before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the government of Rostov region reported about 188 places for billeting Ukrainians from Donbass, and later, by now, they deployed 807 such places. In March 2022, there was a resolution by the Parliament of Russian Federation about the dispersion of Ukrainians across Russian Federation. So there are also facts of creating complications for Ukrainian citizens to live for the territory under control of Ukrainian government. The shellings of the green corridors, humanitarian corridors, which were agreed before. Another case is circumvention. For example, once an affected person was reported that as soon as they arrived to the master point to evacuate in the direction of Zaporizhia, the Russian military allowed the people get on the bus, having stated that those buses are going to Zaporizhia. And the people at the same time were brought to Nikolsk in the depth of the occupied territories and then proceeded to Russian Federation. People were refusing to leave directly to the territory under control of Ukrainian government. Well, there were such reports by the affected persons that they did not want to leave because they were afraid of shellings or they were afraid for their lives. For example, one affected person in Mariupol, in such master point, they were told that she may go either to Russia or to Zaporizhia, wherever she was, but at the place of registration she was told that no one is going to bring her to Zaporizhia and there are only routes of evacuation to Russia. Also, in the shelter, from the shelter, there was a view to a road to Zaporizhia, and the people were able to see as this road is filled with the burned cars, and they were never able to find out whether those people were able to reach their point of destination during evacuation to territories under Ukrainian control. Also, we considered cases of the people being forced to evacuate. So, and this forcing doesn't mean only physical forcing, but creation of the general atmosphere of horror and intimidation, which is inherent in the occupied territories. And due to this forced nature of evacuation, we may state that people didn't have options to leave in terms of directions of their living, and we were able to track that Russia created conditions in the occupied territories under which people were not able to stay there anymore. For example, humanitarian situation created in Mariupol right after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So, full cut of the electric power supply, water supply, heat supply. People were forced to look for potable water by themselves. They were not getting any medical aid. The medical institutions were subject to pillaging and shelling by Russian forces. I want to give a quotation by a citizen of Mariupol about how they were feeling in that area. It was not just a stress, it was the feeling of fear from the very morning until the late night. I was waking up in the night because I was afraid my child would die of hunger. They were asking for either bread or apples, but I had none of those. We were not able to take shower, we couldn't change the clean clothing, we were not able to use the bathroom, and we were observing death everywhere around us. On top of that, in the occupied territories, there is a psychological pressure being exercised against Ukrainian population. With the beginning of the meetings against occupation in Kherson region, they were suppressed with weapons in the Russian forces' hands. For example, organization ZMINA registered 503 cases of disappearance or kidnapping of Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian activists in occupied territories. Moreover, we know that after the occupation there were torture chambers identified in the temporarily occupied territories where the local civilians were tortured, sometimes tortured to death. In Kharkiv region, for example, the Russian forces, they had questions to a man who, due to his place of registration. He was living in Kharkiv region, meanwhile he was registered in the city of Kharkiv. First, it created no problems, but a little bit later, 30 Russian servicemen came back to his yard and forcing him with their weapons. They put a bag on the head of that man and they took him away in the unknown direction. They tortured him and then they brought him to the border with Russian Federation, where he was kept for 5 days and tortured until he was going unconscious. For more 6 days he was forced to work, specifically to build fortifications for Russian military. He was digging trenches and building fortifications, and only after that he and a number of other persons kept there were gathered in one room, and they were told like everything is fine, no one died. We even treated your heart with electricity. And then they were intimidated that should they ever tell anyone what happened to them, they would be kidnapped again and never let go. Yet another way of pressure that Russia uses is the restriction of access to information, the filling of air with Russian news. Moreover, when their mobile communication was off, for example in Mariupol, the citizens were reported by Russian forces that Mariupol is DPR, Ukraine does not exist anymore, that Russia captured all of Ukraine. In Kharkiv region, the people were told that when Ukraine comes back, they will be all convicted of collaborationism because they were all staying in the occupied territories. And in view of all the above, people were acting not at their discretion, and because they were forced to believe that they would only save their lives if they leave to Russia. And it's important to stress that in this case, all those actions, they fall under the definition of deportation, because the fact that people were living by themselves is not being viewed as evacuation, because they were forced to leave because they were afraid for their lives. And in view of the planned nature of such living, preparation of infrastructure in Russian Federation, or organized nature of the movement process, the filtration points deployment, and creation of conditions that were unfit for living. So based on all those conditions, we may state that people made the choice to live under pressure, and the actions of Russian Federation aimed at displacement of people from the occupied territories constitutes the crime of deportation. Ms. Onysiia, we know that Russia blocks information regarding the deported people, both children and adults. We don't have a clear information about the number of those people who were deported, but you as an expert, what's your evaluation of the scale of deportation? I want to make a disclaimer. The scale is big, but I would not like to measure the level of threat by the numbers of displaced. Because even if those figures are small, we should still state that the crime is happening and we should bring all those guilty to liability. The only thing that we may refer to in view of the absence of access to the occupied territories, because it's from there where people live for Russia. All the figures of adults, for example, are only those figures that are named by Russia, but we have to understand that it's the total number. There are people who live for Russia at their own will, and they did so, but those figures named by Russia lately, if I'm not mistaken, they were around 5 million. So among those 5 millions, there are people who were deported to Russian Federation. Some of them still stay in Russian Federation because they are not able to live. They have no means for that. They were sent to remote regions from where it's very difficult to live. Some of them may have crossed the borders for the third countries, to Estonia, Latvia and other countries bordering on Russia, but unfortunately we don't have clear figures on our end. Another component of the crime of the Russians, we had people visiting us who survived the occupation, who were trying to leave, and we were hearing that even in case those people were choosing to leave for Zaporizhia, to leave for the territories under the control of Ukrainian government, the Russians were blocking that route of evacuation. Is it another indicator of the war crime? Yes, this is the restriction of choice, restriction of options in terms of the directions of living. Russia, even should they have exercised the evacuation, and which they did not because there are no reasons for such evacuation, they should have considered the option of moving population inside the country. That's the first thing. People should be given that option to move to the territory under the control of Ukrainian government. Absolutely different obstacles were created just to not people live for the territory under Ukrainian control. For example, in Vasilievka, people were spending days and days in lines, who putting their life in jeopardy. People were just dying in those lives due to exhaustion, or sometimes as a result of a shelling or a strike. We documented a number of cases when the affected persons were naming that as a reason why they decided to go to the third countries through Russia. They were afraid to their lives. They were afraid to go directly to the territory under control of Ukrainian government. Dear colleagues, if you have any questions, please, the floor is yours. Ms. Onysiia, you mentioned that during the deportation the families were separated on purpose. Have you been tracking the further way of those families, including children? What was their destiny? Thank you. One or some of such cases, they were quite public. For example, a girl, Alisa, who was separated from her mother, who was a servicewoman in the Ukrainian armed forces. So now that girl is with her grandmother abroad. Meanwhile, her mom is in Ukrainian territory. So during such cases, or in such cases, the only way we can find out about them is when one person of that separated family was able to leave Russia and report to the law enforcement agencies about such facts. If they stay, for example, in Russia, they would not put their lives in jeopardy by reporting about such cases. So I can state that there are more cases like that. It's just that we don't know about them. Well, another question is, do you have at least approximate figures about the Ukrainians who were able to leave, if not back to Ukraine, so at least for third countries? Well, I cannot give you the exact numbers because all the citizens of Ukraine who crossed the border with Russia, or between Russia and the third countries, they are viewed as deported people because they were staying in Russian Federation before and now they left. Or otherwise, they could be people who were not deported. They were staying in Russian Federation before and then they left for the third countries. So we did not make research about those specific category of people, but the only thing that I can say, what we've observed during our field mission to Baltic countries, for which the Ukrainians mostly were living because they have borders on Russian Federation. What I can say is that many people from Mariupol were deported to Russia and many of them were then able to leave for Baltic countries, specifically to Estonia. Thank you. And my last question will be about your cooperation with the international organization, because we know that the arrest warrant for Putin and Maria Lvova below was issued by International Criminal Court. A significant role, meanwhile, was played by our human rights organization. So what will be your further efforts to make sure that the guilty ones would be punished? Well, you highlighted it correct that the arrest warrant was issued for the deportation of children, and we should not forget about the minors who were deported to Russian Federation, who are under threat because they have no opportunity to leave Russian Federation without their legal representatives. And obviously those guilty of crimes against them should be brought to liability, and more facts that we should be working on, and we keep working on this problem on facilitation of return of children to Ukraine, or at least to the third countries bordering on Russia, because meanwhile Russia declares their intentions, but in fact they do not assist the return of the Ukrainian children back home, and we cooperate with our international partners to work out the procedure, to work out the mechanism which would allow us to press on Russia to work out the practical way, because currently the return of Ukrainian children is going on individual basis. We just do it based on how we manage to do it, and the threat is the longer they stay in Russian Federation, the longer their human rights are under threat. Thank you for this briefing, and we will be back in this studio at 12 o'clock. Let's continue working for our victory together. Thanks to our armed forces, we can hold events like that, so glory to Ukraine.